Welcome to this episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined in studio today by Dr. Jeff Zweerink, who is an astronomer and a Christian apologist, and we're going to be talking about two scientific breakthroughs that provide evidence for the Christian faith. Well, Jeff, welcome to Star Cells and God. You know, you're, of course, one of the hosts and a regular on the show. But
well, it's been a while since we've had a time to sit down and talk on the show, so I'm looking forward to our day.
So, Jeff, without any further ado, maybe we could get into your discovery. It's a discovery in biomimicry, which is one of my favorite topics. So, have at it.
Well, and that biomimicry, has this biomimicry is where you're looking at nature and saying, hey, what do we do or how can we use that? And the particular discovery I was looking at, I found interesting on a number of levels as I've investigated it more, because what they're looking at is, you look at birds, and I think birds are why humans said, hey, can we figure out how to fly?
Yeah.
And we figured out how to fly. I go to the airport and I ride on airplanes, and there's a part of me that this is ludicrous that this thing gets up in the air. And then there's the other part that knows the physics of how it works and says, all right, I'm confident that I can sit on this plane and be okay. But one aspect of you look at how we fly compared to how birds fly, and they are remarkably different. Some of the things that are basic there is you've got to be able to have lift so that you can be up in the air instead of on the ground. You've got to be able to maneuver in the air. And that's all, in some sense, that's kind of where a lot of the similarities end, because the way birds do that compared to the way planes do that is remarkably different. You just think, okay, for a bird, it's flapping its wings, it's using, thermals, other sorts of things. It's in some sense, a far more efficient way to fly, because humans use a very much brute force. Go fast enough, certain shape of wing, there's more pressure on the bottom side than on the top side, pushes the plane up in the air, and as long as you can maintain that speed or above that, then you're at least going to stay in the air. I'll leave it at that much. Whereas, birds use a far different, they've got to be able to jump, generate the lift, get up. It's just a very different phenomena. One aspect of the maneuvering in the air that is very different is that birds, typically they're just wings out. That's all they have. They may have their feet dangling, but pretty much is wings straight out. Whereas every plane has this tail on it. And among the reasons that's important is that when you're up in the air, as gusts of wind, turbulence, things come in, being in the air is not a particularly stable environment. And one of the things that I've just as I've investigated, the specific thing they're looking at is, can we make airplanes, or how is it that birds fly without that tail, or the vertical tail? Because the vertical tail basically serves as a rudder. It allows you to steer, know which direction you're going, and it's actually, as you're flying, because you're not in direct contact with stuff, maneuvering is a lot harder. And I just, growing up in Missouri, I get to spend a reasonable amount of time on boats, and it always impressed me that, you're driving down the car, direct contact with your wheels to the ground. So when you make a little turn, the car does immediately that. Boat, kind of different. Driving along, you want to turn, you can turn, but the boat will skid along the water or whatever. And water's pretty solid, so you don't have to be too much about that. But or if you ever tried to walk on ice or something where there's not direct contact, you got to be much more careful about how you maneuver. Well, now you get up in the air, and so I know Star Wars has it, Star Trek has it, where you've got these flying things that just bank and do stuff on a dime. The only thing you got to push against the air, and air is not provide a lot of resistance unless you're really high velocities. And so that's really what they're dealing with here, is that for a bird, as it flies along, it doesn't have that rudder. And without that rudder, it's very hard. It becomes much harder to maintain going straight, not turning, not rolling, not flipping around. And so what they were looking at in this is what are the mechanisms a bird does or bird uses to maintain control in the midst of not having that rudder. And what they were able to, what they built was a model of, modeled it off a certain kind of pigeon, which I find ironic because when I think bird, I don't think pigeon.
Yeah, I think something more majestic, like an eagle or a hawk. Yeah.
But the nice part about this is that they actually were able to use, they constructed their model out of bird feathers. Because not surprisingly, bird feathers are lighter, more flexible, more adaptable, meshed together than pretty much anything we can make at this point. And so they took a number of feathers, strung them together, both in terms of how the wings operate, but also how the tail feathers operate. And again, just trying to figure out how this works. So to do this, they did a number of investigated how do birds actually do this. And it turns out that there are, I will put them instinctual because they're muscle reflexes, which I think, instinct, and I'm not sure the difference between instinct and reflex, but it's not something the bird is consciously thinking or actively controlling. It just behaves this way. But there are reflexes in the bird that when it gets rotated, so if it's flying along this way, if it rotates, certain muscles activate. If it begins to tip forward or back, other muscles activate. And the one that's interesting to me, I didn't think this originally, but so you got 3 axes you can rotate around, or 2 axes you can rotate this way, you can rotate this way, or along the direction of flight, or you can rotate this way. And that's turns out to be one of the harder things to control because in birds they were trying to, as they rotate around these feathers rotate in different ways. But in airplanes, and this is even true for the airplanes that we fly, we actually have to highly design and tune our planes because one of the things that happens is say an airplane is flying along straight. As long as everything goes straight and the winds are pretty predictable, things behave well. But if you get turbulence or say a gust of wind comes in from the side, what ends up happening, or one of the things that can happen, is this thing called a Dutch roll, which I had to go investigate what that was. But the short answer is that as the plane is flying, it has to maintain its roll, which is the rotating around the axis of the flight, but it also has to maintain its yaw, which is the rotation around that vertical axis parallel or perpendicular to its flight. And when that gust of wind comes in, the way we've designed our wings on most planes is that as the wind direction changes, the wings will have more lift on one side than the other, so it will tend to roll the plane. But as it rolls the plane, it also rotates the plane, and now that rudder is exposed. And the rudder, as it turns this way, there's more exposure, and so it pushes it back. And typically, it tends to oscillate around that instead of just coming right back. So if you can maintain your roll really well, but not your yaw very well, then what will happen is those will just kind of sit there and bounce around, and you end up just kind of oscillating through the air, and you get those sorts of oscillations, and they can become unstable, things crash, that sort of stuff. And so this is all, there's this incredible amount of complexity of what has to be controlled to fly through the air, maintain steady flight, and not crash. And birds do this with none of that vertical rudder, which from a mechanical perspective, it's added mass, it's less fuel efficient because you have more drag there. Right. And so there's a great interest in figuring out how to do this. So they turned and looked at these birds or pigeons or other kinds of birds, recognized that there are these reflexive motions where when the bird starts to do this, certain feathers move around. And so what they did was to build a model that emulated that, to see if they could get a rudderless or a homemade rudderless plane that would fly well. And the short answer is they were able to figure out how to do that. And it turned out that not only, a couple of things that I found interesting in that were that it wasn't just that you needed to adjust the tail feathers or adjust the wings, is that you actually had to have both of those working in concert, or else it wasn't going to work well, because you might be able to, as something changes, you're going to adjust this, but it doesn't get the other axis. And so you really needed kind of two different degrees, more than 2 degrees of freedom, but at least those two large lever arms to do that. And so they were able to build it's called pigeon bot, which I love the names people come up with, instead of just tail bot, because they looked at just the tail and the tail wouldn't work. But when they now get the tail to change the pitch and the roll, and they now can modify the wings as well to make them asymmetrical, they could actually get something that would sit there and spiral in flight, stay up in the air. And it was, there's just a coolness to this. But the apologetic takeaways in this, as I was reading through, were, one, I have always found it remarkable that as technologically sophisticated as airplanes are, we look at how flight works in nature, and it is so much more sophisticated than what we see. That I'm not taking anything away from our technology of how do we build planes and the ingenuity that comes into that. But here we are with all of the planes we can build, how fast we can make them go, the turning capabilities. As we now look at birds, it's like, oh, this is so much more sophisticated than what we're capable of doing. Because, and this is just illustrated that even in this, so we can figure out how to mimic what the birds are doing, and at least we can maintain the stable flight. But now you'd ask the question, what do you need to do to actually implement this? So you've got to be able to sense that the plane is moving one way or the other. Okay, so that's not too hard to do. The fact that they could build that on a lightweight, build those sensors on a lightweight things operated by feathers, that to me is remarkable. But you're talking about planes. There's a fair bit of mass there to put sensors on to detect that. That's not so hard to do. But now you've got to be able to have, once that sensor goes, you've got to be able to have a plane, instead of a solid metallic structure or solid composite structure or whatever it is we're going to build the plane out of, you've got to have something that is strong enough to take impacts, but flexible enough to be able to mold its wings around into various shapes to mimic what the bird is doing. And, they even said, we're using bird feathers because we can't find anything better than bird feathers. They're lightweight. Yeah. They mesh well together. If they get ruffled up, you can straighten them out easily. I mean, they just have a lot of features that are very hard to replicate in that. So, here we are looking. The fact that we say, in spite of all our technology, let's go look at what nature has, that gives us insight into how to build a better mousetrap, says that nature is a little bit more than just a random assemblage, or not random is not the right word, but a haphazard collection of this is what worked in the past. Because this is just elegant in how well it works. Because it's not like the birds are flying along thinking, ooh, I'm starting to roll, better do this. It's instinctual. The motions are built into the bird. So the bird doesn't have to think about it. So it can, I don't know what birds think about when they fly, but they can think about, is that prey over there? Do I want to get that? Is this where I want to land? Those are the sorts of things that the bird has to pay attention to, very much in the same way we don't have to think about breathing. We can just breathe, it works. Flying for a bird is far more sophisticated than any sort of flying we do, and yet it just works seamlessly in the bird. And so I thought that was pretty remarkable as I delved into this, how sophisticated and how much more advanced bird flight is than what we're capable of.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me is this isn't like a one-off study, right? Where, occasionally engineers are recognizing designs in nature that may be useful for solving a problem. This is a vibrant area of engineering. In fact, somewhere along the line, I found a list of the number of publications in biomimetics.
Okay.
in bioinspiration, and it was very close to on the order of 12,000 papers published a year.
Wow, that is quite a bit.
Where people are turning to designs in biology to solve problems. And that, as you're pointing out, just really speaks of the incredible elegance of biological designs. And it really raises questions about if there's an evolutionary history to life exclusively, how on earth, do you have over and over and over and over again, everywhere you look, these elegant designs when you'd expect something very different from the evolutionary process.
Right. Well, and even to add to that point, the only way this works, you think of how that works in birds. So we fly airplanes, we fly somewhere, we land them, we have to refuel them, we have to check all the structures. There's a lot of safety stuff in there. There's a lot of parts. These things just grow in birds. We're kind of passing over the step that somehow cells machinery knows how to generate all this. And, this is the sort of stuff you've written about, so I'm preaching to the choir and talking to you about that. But setting all that aside, just saying, okay, maybe that is just the way nature works. There's still an efficiency about this that rivals what we have because, we fly. I don't even think we use planes a lot. Compared to history, yes, we do. But that's not the dominant way we travel. Most people get around some other ways. It's almost still somewhat a fairly wealthy people get to fly. It's not the common ordinary way because it's an expensive endeavor. It takes a lot of resources to build. It takes a lot of resources to operate. It's very energy intensive. We use fuels. Birds do this on chicken feed. That, the efficiency of being able to eat and produce and take care of all of that from an energy efficiency perspective rivals anything we could do, not just the technology of could we build it in the first place. And so I think there's multiple layers of how what we see in nature is so far beyond what we can see.
Yeah, well, birds have hollow bones, right? And, that's meant to promote their efficiency in flying. Their lung systems, like in our lungs as mammals, when we breathe in, we get oxygen and then we exhale CO2. The bird's lungs are such that they're doing gas exchange both in the intake as well as the exhaling.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So they have a very efficient means of extracting oxygen from the air to help maintain the energy demands that they have. So everything about birds is remarkable, and your point about the feathers is really very interesting because the bird's feathers are just a marvel of design in and of themselves. So
there's another part, and I haven't figured out how to develop this argument, but I think there's something to it, and it's related to artificial intelligence. Is that as far as birds go, the way birds can fly, there's an incredible diversity and yet a simplicity and ease not a simplicity, but a universality that every bird knows how to do it. It's easy to do, but there's this complexity of how it works and reliability of how it works and an efficiency of how it works, coupled in with the ability to stop on a dime, to dive into the water. The range of what it works is incredible. And I think of that with artificial intelligence, but especially in the last couple of years, we've now gotten to the place where we can build computer algorithms that will, for all intents and purposes, look like they're communicating with us. That you can sit down, ask a question, and you'll get a response that looks like you're having a conversation with these things. Okay, fine and dandy. So have we replicated intelligence? Possibly, possibly not. I think that that's not the part of the discussion I'm interested in. What we can do, rolling out of bed, sitting up in the morning, half groggy, it takes incredibly complex computer. The architecture to build it is incredible. The programmers putting it in to do it, the amount of power consumption that it does, where we can use vocal stuff with it. The vocal intonations allow us to communicate. the range of what we're able to do with ease and without even thinking about it, it seems to have a similar sort of thing in there that
interesting.
That we can take various aspects of our humanity and do them better. Maybe we could make prosthetics that would make us faster or whatever. But in doing that, are we losing something else that makes us human in doing that? Yeah. And it seems to me that there's an argument that if you're going to get sentient beings on the earth, that there's an optimality about who we are, that you can make a computer that could operate faster than we can, or do more calculations than we could, or speak more eloquently than we could. But to get the whole human package, at some point, to get more, you're going to have to give up something because it's sub-optimized to the best that it could be, if you will. Yeah. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
That's an interesting argument because, one of the motivations behind creating these AI systems out of brain organoids, this is kind of one of those really bizarre, biotechnology meets, computer science. But the idea is that, instead of building neural nets using electronics, you're actually using neural nets that you would grow in the lab with these brain organoids.
Right.
And you can actually hook them up to, to computer systems and train them.
Oh, wow.
Right. So that it's functioning like a neural net. But part of the motivation for doing this is the energy demand.
Yeah.
It's like for a trickle of energy, you can build these brain organoids and use them as, neural nets for just a fraction of, a minute fraction of the energy demands it would take for an AI system. And that may be what keeps AI from ever taking over, is that eventually you'd have to have so much energy consumption in order to power AI systems that they just become impossible to maintain.
Right. Well, that's the basic premise, the basic plot line of the Matrix, is that they needed so much power. The only way to do that was to subjugate the humans and make them generate them.
Yeah.
No, I just find it interesting. I can, at some level, I can see why people will look and say, oh, there's no God behind it. It's because it's fun to find the mechanisms and all of that sort of stuff in there. But there's just another part when I look at the elegance and efficiency and the fact that, as we're looking at nature to be inspired of how to build a better mousetrap, if it takes our intelligence to build it, the fact that we're borrowing from a greater intelligence to figure out what we're doing to build, that seems to be a pretty powerful argument for God.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, the work in biomimetics fits naturally within a creation model.
Absolutely,
right, within a Christian worldview where you see everything in nature as the handiwork of a creator. If you are holding to strictly materialism, there's no reason why you would want to even turn to designs in biology to inspire technology. You would want to have your head examined to do that. You wouldn't, it's not something that fits within a naturalistic perspective.
So now interesting point. I'm going to just push back on that a little bit because that's what I like to do. But so it seems to me that, I was thinking a little bit about that. How would a natural, or somebody who's a naturalist, how would they respond? And it seems to me they have to make an argument, something to the effect of, well, yes, what we see in nature has to be that way, or it wouldn't have stuck around. That somehow evolution and nature will drive these innovations. And that's why I think I see how you would get that. It's like if it didn't work, it wasn't going to go. The only things that work are these highly, well, for lack of a better word, well-designed systems, so everything's going to look that way. But it seems to me there's some of this that is so intricate in the way it works that it seems to. It doesn't. The mechanism doesn't seem to match the product, if you will.
Well, what I see when I look at papers published in biomimetics is oftentimes people making statements to the effect that, look, evolution had hundreds of millions of years through natural selection to fine tune and discover and optimize these systems in nature. So we're just, taking advantage of evolutionary history.
Right.
Right. But the problem is that when you read how evolutionary theorists understand the evolutionary process, they go out of their way to make the point that the designs we see in biology are kludge jobs, that they're imperfect, flawed designs that are produced by an evolutionary process that's constrained by history, where new designs are co-opting existing designs and cobbling them together, and that they would argue that they are inherently non-optimal, inherently flawed, inherently imperfect.
Right.
And so when you read the discussion of the justification for biomimetics from people working in the field who have a naive view of evolution, they attribute these designs to an evolutionary history. When you read what evolutionary biologists describe, the nature of the evolutionary process, it's deeply anti-teleological.
Right.
And so in that framework, you would not expect biomimetics to emerge, right?
Right.
So I think it's a perspective on evolution that doesn't fit what the leading thinkers in evolutionary theory would actually advocate.
Right.
And in fact, many evolutionary biologists are strongly opposed to what's called adaptationism, which is this idea that natural selection is going to produce these highly optimal designs. It's going to fine-tune and shape, new biological designs, because they see that as having a teleological nature. So even if you say, look, life does have an evolutionary history, you are operating in a teleological regime where you're saying that evolution is capable of creating these elegant designs. So you're, the criticism of adaptationism by people like Stephen Jay Gould, for example, is that this is essentially one step away from creationism.
Gotcha.
So,
no, that's an interesting point. And I think that's where I wrestle with, how do you do this from a naturalistic perspective? Because if I get what you're saying, the stuff that's functional in nature will just be functional. Whereas some of this looks like it's not just functional, it's incredibly functional. So functional that we're looking for that to make what we have better.
Yep.
So it's not just getting by, it's doing something far more than just getting by.
Yeah, I mean, there's an optimization, but there's also this ingenuity.
Right.
When you're saying, well, this is just cool, right? Well, I mean, that's, to me, that's a code word for saying there's an ingenuity here that is stunning, that's remarkable, right? And how do you quantify ingenuity? I don't know, but but when you look at you recognize it when you see it, right?
Yeah. So that's what I had. Like I said, I find I brought that in, but it's like Manta Ray is inspired, soft, fast swimming, soft robot, bird inspired drone can take off. To your point, this isn't just a one-off. This is people are actively finding ways to use this and building better mousetraps out of looking at what nature does.
Yeah, biomimetics is great stuff. All right, well, what I want to do to begin my discussion is talk about a proverb or a quote, a statement that my father used to make to me all the time, that good things come to those who wait. And I think that was just his way of trying to build some patience in me, but also probably not wanting to spend money because, because I wanted something. And so I was just kind of curious as to where that expression came from. That's just one of the things I like to do is where do these expressions come from?
Yeah.
And some people attribute it to Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
Others attribute it to a poet by the name of Violet Fane, who in 1892 wrote a poem, "All hoped for things will come to you." So who knows what the ideology is, but I think, Jeff, you would agree with me that is not only a kind of a proverb that encourages, development of patience, but it actually applies, I think, to the work that we do at Reasons to Believe regarding scientific apologetics. Is there's oftentimes these scientific consensus about the way biological systems are or the way the universe is that seem to be in contradistinction to what we'd expect from a Christian worldview, right? And my experience is that if you wait long enough, oftentimes the consensus will shift in light of new discoveries, and almost always will shift in such a way that what seemed to be a problem for the Christian faith evaporates, and what's replacing it as the new paradigm is something that is far more compatible with Christianity. And
regardless of whether the people who are adopting the new paradigm would call it compatible with Christianity.
Yes, that's a really good point. Right, that's a really good point. And in a sense, the paper I want to talk about fits into that category.
Okay.
And this is work done by a team of Chinese scientists who are trying to understand the natural history of human chromosome 2. And for many people, they see the ultrastructure of human chromosome 2 as really prima facie evidence that humans had an evolutionary history, that our origin is only explained through an evolutionary process. And of course, that would be problematic for those of us who would take the view that human beings reflect God's handiwork, that reflect the work of a creator. So at Reasons to Believe, we take a view that God created human beings de novo, physically and spiritually, in his image, and that we would express deep skepticism about the idea that humans are the product of an evolutionary history. And towards that end, we would say, look, the shared features that we see between humans and, let's say, the great apes, it reflects common design. We would see the hominin fossil record is real, but yet we would see that those creatures as being creatures that God created, that existed, that went extinct. We would argue that only modern humans bear God's image, and so we would expect similarities, but also significant differences, primarily with respect to behavior. But, to be clear, the reigning evolutionary view and the reigning scientific view for human origins is an evolutionary one. And you might see diagrams like this one, where for our purposes, what we want to focus on is the red circle, which is presumably some ancestral population that existed 6 to 7 million years ago that gave rise over time to two separate lineages, one culminating in chimpanzees and bonobos and the other culminating in modern humans. And where, again, presumably this evolutionary history is documented through the existence of these hominins as transitional forms. But again, as I pointed out, is that the prevailing evidence for human evolution, again, the shared biological features, the fossil record, could be accommodated within a creation model framework. It's not the mainstream view, but you could, I think, with integrity accommodate that evidence in a creation model framework. The one outstanding issue would be human chromosome 2, right? And so human beings have, in each cell in our body, at least the first approximation, there's some cells that don't have genetic material, like red blood cells, but for first approximation, every cell in our body has 46 chromosomes, or two sets of 23 chromosomes.
Right.
22 autosomes, and then of that set, each set is made up of 22 autosomes and then a sex chromosome, either X or Y. And at the point of fertilization, we get one set of those chromosomes from our father, one set from our mother, right? And when the fertilization happens, those two sets unite in the nucleus of the zygote, and then you have that full complement, right? Well, it turns out that chimpanzees have 48 chromosomes, two sets of 24.
Okay.
And when you look at two of the chimpanzee chromosomes, which are labeled chromosome 2A and chromosome 2B, the architecture, the ultrastructure, the architecture of those chromosomes looks very similar to human chromosome 2, and it looks as if there was an end-on-end fusion. So, for example,
so presumably those were somewhat shorter chromosomes or something
Yes.
like that in the chimpanzees. So there's two sets, or there's, say we got one, they've got one, we've got two, they have 2 and 3 or 2 and 2A or whatever you want
Yes.
to call them, and they're smaller, but in humans it looks like they've been put together.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, you can expose chromosomes to different dyes, and those dyes will differentially bind to different regions of the chromosome, which means that there will be some areas where the dye binds, some areas where it doesn't. And then when it does bind, it binds to a greater or lesser degree, and that creates these banding patterns in the chromosome. And when you look at human chromosome 2 and chimpanzee chromosome 2A and 2B, the banding patterns align if you assume basically an head-to-head fusion.
So that means there's got to be some pretty high degree of chemical similarity between the two.
Yes,
is what that means.
Yeah. So the banding is giving you insight into the chromosome fine structure. So this is a diagram that people have probably seen if they're familiar with this, showing basically the two chimpanzee chromosomes and their comparison to the human chromosome 2. Now, when you look at human chromosome 2, the structure of human chromosome 2 to a greater degree, you also see some other features. For example, there are two sets of telomeric sequences that are internal in human chromosome 2. Now, telomeric sequences
And that would be, do other chromosomes have that?
No.
So it's just chromosome 2, okay.
Yes. And the telomeres are these regions on the tip end of chromosomes that have a specialized DNA sequence that gives structural integrity to the chromosomes.
Okay.
Right? And so the fact that you see these internal telomeric sequences suggests fusion, right?
Right.
A telomere-telomere fusion. You also see two centromeres, and a centromere is a region of the chromosome in which the mitotic spindle binds to separate the chromosomes during cell division. And the fact that you see two of them,
right,
it means, again, it looks like there were two chromosomes that fused together. And, when I look at the structure of human chromosome 2, it's really hard to argue that there wasn't a fusion event that took place. And so the argument then, from an evolutionary perspective, is, well, at some point in that lineage that led to modern humans, there was a population of hominins where these two chromosomes fused, resulting in human chromosome 2. And that must have actually happened before the split that gave rise to the lineage that leads to Neanderthals and Denisovans in modern humans, because in the genomes of Neanderthals and the genomes of Denisovans, it's evident that there was a chromosome 2 that was looks to be the result of the fusion of two chromosomes. So this seems to be a compelling evolutionary argument that is not really based on homologies. It's not really based on the fossil record. It's based on the ultrastructure of human chromosome 2. How else do you explain this, right?
Can I ask a question that's a little bit of a diversion, but
Sure.
Maybe a minute or two diversion before you're back? So you see in chimps that it looks like there are these two chromosomes. In humans, it looks like there's the one. Is there anything scientifically that says that the two merged to one as opposed to the one split and became two?
It would be the presence of the two centromeres and the presence of the telomeric sequences. So if you had one chromosome that split into two, you'd have to have one of those chromosomes likely wouldn't have a centromere. And
so I guess my question is, would it be really weird to have a chromosome that had 2 centromeres.
Yes.
Okay, so it's like that's kind of the hallmark of it went this way, not the other way.
Yes.
Okay, that's a fair point. Okay.
Yeah. So you would not expect there to be, a chromosome that had 2 centromeres. In fact, if there were 2 active centromeres, as we'll learn in a minute, that creates huge problems.
Gotcha. Okay.
The cell's machinery that separates chromosomes gets confused if there's 2
that
centromeres.
Makes sense,
Yeah. So you can only really have one. Right. So anyway, so the fact of the matter is it does look like there was fusion. And when I wrote the first edition of Who Was Adam, was well aware of this. And at that point in time, again, this idea of all good things come to those who wait, the best I could do is to say, look, it looks like there was fusion that took place, but there's some things that are a little bit troubling to me. One is you would not expect there to be fusions with 2 telomeres because the whole point of telomeres is to prevent chromosomes from fusing with each other.
Okay.
That's how you prevent chromosome fusion in the cell and it creates chromosomal stability. Now, if you do lose the telomere, that can happen. You wind up getting an unstable chromosome, and typically that will trigger what's called a Robertsonian fusion, where you get chromosomes fusing with each other. But it's not a telomere-telomere fusion. It's a different type of chromosomal fusion.
Different than what we see in chromosome 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this isn't just some chimpanzee or whatever organism lost one of the telomeres and that fused, because that would have a different signature than what we see.
Yes. Okay. Exactly. And in Robertsonian fusions, not always, but oftentimes lead to significant health effects.
Okay.
Deleterious health effects, right? And let's say and then oftentimes if you have a mismatch in the number of chromosomes, so let's say in the paternal line, in the sperm, you had this telomere-telomere fusion, but it's not going to happen in the egg. The probability of happening in an egg,
right,
is going to be very low for another individual, right? And so the idea that you'd have a mismatch in the number of chromosomes actually leads to either a non-viable offspring, or if the offspring is viable, it's going to be sterile. It's not going to be able to have children. So there's a number of things that make the idea of that fusion highly improbable, right? It's not something that I would argue that you would expect. So to me, with the first edition of Who is Adam, we argued and carried the argument over into the second edition. We argued that this looks like a divine act.
Right.
Right. Just the improbability of it. But
so you're saying, yes, it does look like a fusion, but the fact that the fusion happened is not, we wouldn't expect this to happen naturally. This is the signature of something extraordinary happening to make it happen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's where you would see, a divine fingerprint. Now, after the second edition of Who Was Adam was published, this is maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago now, there were 2 independent research teams that were trying to understand telomere-telomere fusion in chromosomes. And so they were studying yeast. And each group independently was engaged in the project, and they published papers together, right? Or 2 separate papers, but they ended up publishing them at the same time. And their idea was in yeast, which is a single-celled organism, has 16 chromosomes, was to try to fuse all those chromosomes end to end into a single chromosome.
Okay.
One team was only able to do it to the point where there were 2 chromosomes. The other team was able to get a single chromosome, right? And
yeast that was still functional and viable and still lived properly.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah. And so, in yeast, there's 16 chromosomes. They're different lengths. And so in order to get the fusion to work, they first of all had to very precisely pair chromosomes together to fuse.
Okay.
So you couldn't just randomly start fusing chromosomes. You actually had to select the right chromosomes to fuse, and then in turn of those that resulted, select the right ones to fuse in order to get either 2 chromosomes or 1 chromosome. So this was not a haphazard process. They also discovered that you had to, in order to get the fusion to take place, they had to delete the telomeric sequences, but they had to be highly precise, because if they didn't delete it in the just right place, they would actually end up damaging genes that were adjacent to the telomeres. So it was a high precision. So this is very different than just the telomere breaking off, right? This was a high precision removal of the telomeric sequences to drive the fusion. And then you would wind up with chromosomes that had 2 centromeres. And if they didn't delete one of the centromeres simultaneous with the fusion, the yeast wasn't viable, because it couldn't figure out how to separate the chromosomes in cell division.
How do you delete a centromere?
With CRISPR gene editing.
Okay, so this is CRISPR stuff that was going on. Okay.
Yeah. And they also had to make sure that when they fused the chromosomes, that the centromere that resulted, now that single centromere, was near the center of the chromosome. If it was too far to either extreme, again, it would mess up cell division. So the point is this was a very, this required highly knowledgeable scientists who were among the best scientists in the world, working under highly controlled conditions, developing a very elaborate strategy that they had to execute, again, with high precision in a non-random, highly strategic way. That, to me, looks like, in order for chromosomes to fuse, telomere, it requires intelligent agency to be involved. This is not something you would expect random processes to naturally do, because of just the precision of deleting the telomeric sequences, the precision of, or the need to, get the centromere in the right spot to immediately disable the centromere. And so when hypothetically, the 2 chimpanzee chromosomes fuse, you're going to have 2 active centromeres, right? And we know that in human chromosome 2, one of them is active and one of them has been disabled.
Right.
But if that doesn't happen right away, that's actually going to be problematic, for the resulting, offspring that's generated. So the point is that the intuition that we had that this looks like it's designed is supported by the work by these 2 teams looking at what does it take to fuse yeast chromosomes. Well, so that at least allows us to make with integrity the argument that maybe human chromosome 2 is indeed a fusion event, but it was something that God did for we don't know why, but it's something that God did. But there wasn't really an explanation. Why would God, create human beings with a fused chromosome? And this is where this new paper comes into play, because these researchers were doing one of the most detailed studies of the natural history of human chromosome 2. And there's a number of things that they learned that I'm not going to get into just for the sake of time. So
natural history meaning what? Just looking at various individuals and organisms that had chromosome 2, what does it look like?
So
they
were looking
those
at
sorts of things?
Primates and looking at their chromosome structure and then trying to piece together how would this fusion happen, when would it have happened, what were the details of how human chromosome came to be.
I'm just curious how you do that, because at some level you've got to be able to get genetic material that far back, correct? Or is there something else they're doing?
Well, what you're doing is you're doing a highly detailed sequencing of chromosomes, right?
Of modern day chromosomes?
Yes, in a number of primates. So they looked at.
Okay. So this isn't. We've got a history of these people, these organisms had that.
You're trying to reconstruct the
Gotcha.
natural
Okay, I see what you're saying. All right.
From evolutionary principles.
Okay.
Right. And this is only possible now because centromeric sequences and telomeric sequences are highly repetitive. So when you're sequencing genomes, it's very difficult to sequence those regions. So when human chromosome, or the human genome, was sequenced, there was about 10 to 15% that wasn't sequenced because it was highly repetitive DNA, where the techniques you use to sequence the DNA just get confused. So people have, pushed past that and have developed ways to sequence these highly repetitive sequences. So with that understanding in place, they're now able to go and do the sequencing of the centromeric and telomeric regions in primate, chromosomes, and then from that piece together what they think was the evolutionary history of human chromosome 2. And I mean, it's a very interesting study. I'm not going to get into a lot of the findings just simply because they're not really important for what we want to talk about. But one of the things they did in this study, which was really interesting, is they tried to understand was there a functional basis for the fusion? So in other words, the argument would be, in evolutionary terms, if there was a functional utility to that fusion, that would actually perhaps drive the instantiation of the fused chromosome within the hominin population. So what they did is they took a human...
Again, just so that I'm understanding that. So we know how telomeres and these centromeres work, and any sort of scenario where you've got them fusing together, we know to be deleterious.
Yes.
So either there's got to be something where it's either neutral or beneficial. So even if it does happen, there's got to be something that keeps it around.
Right.
Not just would allow it to happen a couple of times, but that it might happen multiple enough times that it can now become incorporated into the lineage some way.
Yeah, that there's some advantage
that
this fusion is creating that's driving natural selection.
Right.
And so what they did is they took a human cell line and they used CRISPR gene editing and they edited out the telomeric sequences in human chromosome 2. And they did it and created two separate cell lines with the telomeric sequences edited out using different versions of the CRISPR technique, right? And what they ended up discovering in both cases is that when they removed the telomeric sequences, it dramatically impacted gene expression profiles for a couple hundred genes that are found on human chromosome 2. And so what that's telling us is that those telomeric sequences, we don't know how, seem to be influencing gene expression patterns. So in other words, this is the missing piece of our argument, which is there's a functional reason why God would create a chromosome that was the fusion of two chimpanzee chromosomes, right?
So flesh that out, because I'm missing the connection.
So in other words, the way our argument unfolds is that we could see human chromosome 2 as God's handiwork, not an evolutionary outcome, because it's a highly improbable event. And from the yeast study, we have confirmation that it looks like in order to get fusion to take place, it requires the work of intelligent agency. What was missing was why. Why would a creator do this? It seems arbitrary, right? Whereas from an evolutionary perspective, it just happened, right? But now that we know that when you remove those telomeric sequences, it alters gene expression, it means that those telomeric sequences internally are playing a critical role, and that this now gives the rationale for why a creator would do that.
So the idea would be, okay, when you're in the chimpanzees or whatever that lineage is, having the two chromosomes where you've got the telomeres, you're going to get certain kinds of gene expression. By removing the telomeres and fusing them, you're now going to get a different kind of gene expression that could presumably drive different behavior that God is desiring or wanting to or creating in humans. That's the idea.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So it doesn't tell us yet what those genes were or how that led to humanity.
Well, we know what genes have altered expressions. We don't know what the functional significance is, but we do know that there is a functional significance.
Okay, so there's a doing this isn't just, now we're fused and we go on. It actually makes changes that would have implications for the subsequent organisms. Okay. I get the argument.
And so like when you look at the human origins creation account, Genesis 1, it's interesting because there are two different creation verbs that are used to describe the creation of humanity. Asa, which means to fabricate something new from existing material, and bara, which means to originate something new. And so with humans, we are both a saw and bara creations. So maybe as part of the way that God created us, it involved, using existing material, infusing it to create human chromosome 2. And again, there appears to be a functional reason why God did that. The next question is what specifically was the benefit of that? But we don't know, but we do know there must have been a benefit because gene expression changes.
Right.
And then you could also see God, in creating in us the image of God, which makes us unique. And it's interesting in Genesis 2, Adam is made from the dust of the earth, and so are the animals.
Right.
And so that means that there's similarities we're going to have physically, biologically, with other animals. And so when we see, through that lens, the structure of human chromosome 2 and its similarity to chimpanzee chromosome 2A and 2B, it's an insight that is fully compatible with the human origins creation account. And now that we know why, we have a robust counter-interpretation to human chromosome 2.
This your discussion here, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, for a long time, I often thought of evangelism or spreading the gospel as kind of an information problem, if you will, that if people just had the right information, then they would want. And I'm seeing that a little differently now. I think it's less an information problem and more a will problem. And what I find interesting about this is that, from a practical, as I read Scripture, it's like there's abundant evidence that God's there. You just look at Jesus walking the earth. I was reading a passage the other day where Jesus is doing things that clearly show he's divine, and then some people just didn't want him. They invited him, encouraged him, and drove him out of the region, if you will. So the people who want to see God active, there's abundant evidence that is there. To the people who don't, there's enough plausible explanations that they're not compelled to see this as God. Yeah. And this explanation kind of strikes me as that you can look at that and say, okay, from a naturalist, this it's weird, but it makes sense, and I can continue to believe this. But as a Christian, I can look at that. It's like there's an elegance and a beauty in the way God's operating here, and it's not we're both looking at the same information. Yeah, but as you were describing, I see God's sophistication and ingenuity and his care and his love. But others can look at the same thing and rationally, and I don't want, that's air quotes, not to be pejorative there, but they're not being irrational to say maybe this isn't God. Yep. And that's the point I'm making there. So.
Yeah. And and of course, when we present the idea that, look, the features that we see in nature are the handiwork of a creator, we want to do it with integrity. We want to say, look, we can actually explain why things are the way that they are. Right. At least, to some limited ability, given what science allows us, that we can explain that this is maybe the rationale for why God did things this way. We're thinking God's thoughts after him, so to speak, right? And that this is a framework in which we can interpret the data robustly but with integrity in a creation model framework. So we want it to be satisfying, right?
Yes.
By all means. But I think I would agree with you is that, there are, it's quite possible to look at the origin of humanity and be completely rational and say it looks like it's an evolutionary origin. That doesn't necessarily exclude God, but it's completely reasonable to say it looks like an evolutionary origin. What I am sometimes frustrated with is that there are, Christians who embrace evolutionary creation who oftentimes look pejoratively at creationists as somehow being willfully ignorant, right? Or just being unwilling to look at the evidence. I think we are looking at the evidence, but we're realizing that there's other ways to interpret that evidence that is compatible with a creation model perspective. But, you have to do this and be in it for the long haul, right?
Good things come to those who wait, huh?
Yeah, good things come to those who wait to kind of, bring it to a close, but there's a larger lesson here, and that is, when you think about the story of junk DNA, when I started with reasons to believe, there was literally nothing we could say to respond to the junk DNA argument. And here we are, 25 years later, and most people that work on the human genome now automatically assume there must be functional utility for these so-called junk DNA sequences. They still don't abandon an evolutionary framework largely, but they are making statements that, people that hold to an ID or a creation perspective have been making for 25 years.
Right. That's I'm not sure. It's one of these. To the extent I want to write a book, one of the projects I've wanted to do, and it's sort of what Escaping the Beginning is. One example of this, where you look at that a little bit more from a historical perspective. Not can I make an argument for God from what we know today, but it's like looking at where were we and where are we now. That if you look at the idea about a beginning, there's still a lot of scientists who don't think there's a beginning, but you look at how the models that are there and what they said and how they've progressed to what they look like today, it's like that looks a whole lot more like creation than it did back then. And I think if to the extent I've understood what you're saying, the multi-regionalism out of Africa is another example of that. Junk DNA is an example of that. Maybe even it seems like there are numerous examples, fairly large. Not just here's a specific study, but where whole areas of thought about a topic have gone from, this is clearly naturalistic to, well, it's naturalistic, but it looks a whole lot more like I would have expected given what the Bible said. So
yeah, that's a great way to end. All right, well, thank you so much for watching this episode. We would invite you to join the discussion in the comments below. And also remember to like the video and subscribe for more content. New episodes of Star Cells and God will release every Wednesday and are available to you here on YouTube as well as on your favorite podcast app. And be sure to share this video with a friend. And remember, the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe.